having said all that, let's go ahead and get started with our next topic. It's sort of a little light from a technical perspective, but I'll try to dig into a couple aspects of it that you may find more interesting, and this is the topic of social engineering. It kind of falls also into that sort of grab bag or hodgepodge of things that aren't maybe the traditional sort of pen testing approach, as we also talked about physical security, but it's additional tools in the toolbox, either from performing a pen test or understanding risks to an organization. When we talk about social engineering, what we're really referring to is the social side of things. We're attacking less so maybe technical vulnerabilities in an organization or a computing system. We are talking more about attacking the actual human user or users of a computing system. Now, that does not mean this is not entirely a non-technical topic here. There's both sort of interpersonal approaches, which we'll pretty quickly sort of gloss over, but then also just technology-based approaches to doing social engineering. And then I thought to add a little bit more, modern relevance to this topic, I wanted to talk a little bit, and this will be next week, sort of machine learning 101 and how ML is kind of radically adapting and changing approaches to social engineering. We're really getting to the place where things that were thought of as kind of fiction and spy thrillers and the like are becoming much more and more feasible and practical from a social engineering perspective. So it's an interesting time to be alive and to be in this field. In terms of what we can cover in this class, really making sure everyone has the 101 view of what is feasible, and try to project out what may be the case, a few years down the line here. Those of you who've already started in this week's lab, involves using the social engineering toolkit. It's a little wonky in the sense that you're performing a social engineering attack on yourself, so it doesn't really feel authentic in that sense. But getting a feel for the kind of tools that are capable, that are possible, what would happen underneath the hood in terms of a social engineering phishing attack, and you see that in lab, and we'll talk about that today as well. So a more formal definition of social engineering would be the clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust. We are kind of inherently trusting people, and are there ways we can use underlying technology or an entirely non-technical way? Can we sort of con or basically trick people to perform actions or to reveal information that they otherwise did not intend to reveal? And there's a taxonomy associated with that where this is kind of a left to right view, but the taxonomy is talking about whether it's technology-based approaches or people-based approaches. You can think of that as technological approaches or entirely just social-based approaches. And there, from within technology, we can split in terms of whether it's really just based on just traditional computing technology, or it has more to do with what people are using with their mobile devices. Likewise, when we talk about just kind of the trickery or the conning that happens on the social side of things, whether it's sort of a physical impersonation or whether it's using voice or other ways of defrauding or kind of scamming people here. And the point of learning this topic, just like with the rest of our kind of pen testing, ethical hacking approach, is not to learn how to be better at conning and tricking people. Perhaps there's some value gained in learning these techniques and maybe even trying them out in a controlled environment, so you gain more expertise in terms of what they are in practice, but to also just raise that awareness, right? If you're on the defense side of your organization, being aware that beyond just the closing of particular ports and checking logs of your intrusion detection system, understanding the social aspect that in some systems, in some organizations, it's the humans, it's the users that are in fact the weakest link of the chain here. Otherwise though, in some sense, the steps associated with social engineering are really not that different from our traditional sort of hacking methodology, in that there is some sort of reconnaissance or intelligence gathering stage, which may in fact not be any different than what we were already doing, right? We played around a little bit with that earlier in the semester, where as you start to identify specific people as part of the organization's chain of authority, you can discover personal things about those people as well, and that may be useful in terms of impersonating them later. So there is still some reconnaissance, some intelligence gathering stage. There's then needs to be some sort of attack planning and then final launching, and then reporting back, right? Some sort of debrief if this is as part of an actual pen test. It's really not different, although the tools one winds up using are different. From a process perspective, it's really not that different from the traditional ethical hacking approach here. It's not something you just do blindly. You learn more about the underlying systems, in this case also then the sort of human systems associated with an organization. You then look at what tools are appropriate for the particular tasks, and then you actually launch that attack to show what kind of weaknesses there are from a social engineering perspective. In terms of the interpersonal aspects of social engineering, it is thought of as an orthogonal concern from what can be done from a technology perspective, but oftentimes these attacks use some aspect of both. Part of it is to what extent you're capable of acting as an impersonator. That does not necessarily mean, channeling your inner Gary Oldman and being an actor and a master of various disguises, although that could be part of it. Part of it is learning how to communicate as a trusted member of an organization that you're not currently a member of. That can be discovered through observation, actual in-person observation, observation of sort of, externally leaked messaging associated with the organization. But certainly if we're talking about that aspect, the Hollywood aspect of it, it's things like, doing that reconnaissance of the actual physical perimeter of that organization or location, right? What are people wearing when they go? Where are the actual entries and exits of the location, the building? What have been the requirements for people to enter? What kind of things are being checked as people are entering and exiting? What kind of actual security does one have to get past? That is related to what we talked about specifically with physical security, but it kind of goes hand in hand, right? If your goal is to gain physical access to a location, what do you have to do to be able to impersonate someone who should in fact have that access? And then on the flip side, if you're thinking about people who are accessing your organization and how one would detect them, you have to kind of start game planning and thinking about what would these scenarios look like. What would happen if someone was trying to impersonate a user seeking actual help, an employee or perhaps a contractor or a vendor who's just visiting, a janitor, or what would happen if someone's pretending to be law enforcement? That sounds a little silly that we have to worry about sort of fake law enforcement. In practice, while we oftentimes worry more about sort of this technical impersonation versus the Hollywood style of impersonation with disguises and whatnot, both actually do happen. There's a few different examples one can find, specifically when thinking about impersonating law enforcement, in which there are various robberies that take place. Now, why they're referred to as Ocean's 11 is that, that's just one small part of the Ocean's 11, movies, but now it's a long franchise. But the idea being that thieves were impersonating policemen and they stole equipment from a data center. As an organization, you have to have a policy then. What happens when someone or a group of people show up claiming to be law enforcement with a warrant? The solution to that cannot just be you have a piece of paper and you're wearing a badge, please come on in. There has to be an organizational, also a legal response to such a thing. It can't be as simple as saying, this person looks trustworthy, consequently we need to be able to give them access to our facility. There has to be a process that everyone involved in the security perimeter of your organization needs to be aware of when that's the case. So that's still a little bit Hollywood, hence Ocean's 11. You have to be aware of that. What happens when people claiming to be in various categories show up at your entrance, don't have physical access, don't have the correct key card and the like? What do you do? What is your policy when those people show up? More common, more typically what one is referring to when you see this term social engineering is this broader concept of phishing, in which we're using usually technical communications channels, although before the term existed, there was all sorts of mail fraud, which was effectively phishing through the US Postal Service. But phishing refers to generally either via phone or via email, via communication that way. Fraudulent communications claiming to be from a trusted source. Traditionally has been email. You see lots of SMS or text message phishing these days. The term doesn't really roll off the tongue, smishing or something like that when it's SMS phishing. You can still use the umbrella term phishing to refer to all of these type of attacks. The idea is being that you have some sort of communication that looks reasonably close to an expected trustworthy communication, and you're basically fooling people. You're tricking people, and depending on who you're attempting to trick, it may fall into further subcategorizations, but you're effectively tricking people into clicking some sort of link that was malicious in an attempt to just directly install malware or present credentials for authentication or just leaking information they weren't intended to link. And I think those of us who are in a class like this, you may look at these examples and say, well, this is for grandma and grandpa, and we have to watch out for them. But it's not entirely that. There's several classes of people who will fall for these type of attacks. There are the technologically less able. That's certainly part of it. Those who haven't gained a certain level of internet savvy, either due to age, whether older age or in fact younger age, who may be more susceptible to clicking these kind of links. The other kind of the category of people we see who fall for these attacks of the type where you would look at in a vacuum and say, well, I would never click that link, tend to be the highly multitasking, exceptionally busy people who need to get through 200 emails an hour or something along those lines. They tend to be the ones who would fall for these sort of attacks. Technologically quite savvy oftentimes, although not necessarily the case. Those who are just not paying that close of attention because of maybe the throughput of work they have to get through. So I provide this link, and I would actually ask if you can open up these slides for this topic on Canvas. There's a lot of links you may want to follow here. I have a few of them open here, but this is just an example of the site in that link for what some phishing emails can look like corresponding to those equivalent services here. And I think one takeaway can be that while sort of anti-phishing technology has also improved effectively by necessity as more and more people get kind of tricked by these things, there are still things that one has to look for when reviewing these messages. That if you're not comfortable and not familiar and you're not in that mindset of sort of defensive link browsing, defensive email and text message reading, you may in fact still get tricked by even those of you in this class who are going to sit it through today and learn all about phishing and explore what kind of things can happen with it. You may still in fact get tricked. How many people get Workday notifications in their inbox? Most of you have any sort of job or other responsibility on campus. I get 20 to 30 a day, most of which I can ignore. About 3 or 4 I actually have to click on each time. One day I'm going to get caught. I just know it, because all it's going to take is someone crafting a sufficiently good Workday notification email. And when I'm doing a lot of them, when I'm walking from building to building and I just want to get it out of my inbox, I'm sure I'm going to click one of those one of these days. So that's what these examples are, to show that while maybe we see examples that are just so obviously just meant trying to get anybody via spamming as many people as possible, getting them to click a link, for any legitimate looking email from a service, someone can review those and generate a fraudulent equivalent of the same. So when I say, you would never fall for this, probably not. You probably will easily discard 999 out of 1,000 type attempts, but that one would cause you a lot of grief. Related to that, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different variants of phishing, is this concept of baiting. And we did a little bit of this in class, and I guess one learning outcome of this class is not to trust your instructor when he provides you with USB sticks or links or things of that nature. This idea that it's a so-called real-life Trojan horse that typically uses physical media and relies on greed or curiosity. I won't load up this paper here, but it's from 2016. There's been variants of that have been sort of reproduced over time. This is at University of Illinois, where they had 297 USB drives, basically like the rubber ducky example we did in class, but just their own custom version of it, that they littered around UIUC's campus in somewhat interesting locations. So some were just left directly in parking lots and sort of in the way spots in parking lots. Others were left on random benches and tables and the like. Again, this is 2016, and this could be a statistic that would change dramatically from year to year. And I don't actually know if we were to reproduce this experiment, which do not do without pre-authorization, if we were to reproduce this experiment on our campus, what the numbers would look like. But to me, those numbers are pretty interesting, I think. Roughly 300 were scattered on campus. they must have been placed in pretty good locations because almost all of them, nearly all of them, were in fact picked up when they went by a few days later to see where they were. Almost all of them were picked up, and a whole bunch of them were in fact actually plugged in. And that's the main conclusion of that particular research paper, which is users really do plug in USB drives that they find. Probably these days, and we talked about that a little bit last week with the rubber ducky example, I'm guessing if you were to find just a pretty nondescript USB drive sitting on a counter here on campus or sitting in a hallway on the floor, I'm guessing you're probably not picking that up. Or if you are, you're being a good citizen and returning it to a lost and found or something like that. Probably a nondescript one. But if you see a fun little USB toy of some sort, right? Perhaps you are picking that one up. I don't know. I'm curious to see what the numbers would look like if that experiment was rerun exactly today. But that is a type of phishing, right? That's sort of phishing with a physical device that you're not getting people to click a link, but you're getting them to effectively plug in that device that they really shouldn't be. In terms of other phishing subcategorizations, and to what extent this taxonomy of terms in phishing is that important, it's hard to say. I guess one thought is that they're relatively clear definitions, so I think we can cover this ground and you're not going to get overwhelmed with it. So phishing in general is the term you want to know, which is you're basically conning someone into clicking a link by presenting something as being legitimate, which is not. Spear phishing is just a phishing attack that is attempting to target specific individuals versus just, although this is showing a bobber, if phishing in general is casting a relatively wide net, spear phishing is casting a really narrow one. It's trying to target individuals, typically by name or by role, versus just trying to target as many people as you can. Both can potentially have their value, right? But if there is really one or a number of people at an organization that you really want to get their particular login credentials or have them leak information, you would want to try something a little bit more targeted. It's not as critical of a distinction, but you'll see this term also called whaling, which is kind of following the capital F phishing metaphor here. But whaling is where you're spear phishing, where you're targeting the big fish, the CEO or the CSO or someone whose authority or credentials would be considered most important associated with an organization. We see these kind of attacks at Iowa State on occasion. So people have spoofed my email and sent it to the department and said things like, and this relates a little bit more to what's on the next slide, saying things more like, I'm in some trouble, can you message me back? And then it's not me, generally. And then it turns out it's someone asking the potential target of the attack to purchase gift cards and the like. And I've had some colleagues, come to my office and say, did you really need me to purchase you gift cards? And that leaves me in a bit of an ethical quandary. Well, would you actually purchase me gift cards if I asked for them? Because I could use gift cards. But you would think people at Iowa State, faculty members in electrical and computer engineering department, would see that as being obviously an attempt to phish someone, but not necessarily always. So you have to watch out for those. Like, for example, it's that time of year again, but the 2016 DNC attacks, for which many of you were quite young, but were a very big deal at the time, were launched via what I think today we would look at as a fairly lame spear phishing email. I will actually bring up the email. This is on WikiLeaks, still available today. And this was, I take my word for it, this was considered a pretty big deal right around 8 years ago today. The hack itself happened quite a bit earlier in the calendar year than October timeframe, but it was a very big deal when this kind of information kind of leaked out. Rightly or wrongly it was, but it was a pretty big deal. I think probably we could scroll from the bottom of this email and this would be the starting point. This is the actual phishing email from Google. Looks legitimate to a pretty high-ranking person in the campaign. Someone has your password. Someone has your password. Someone just used your password assigned to your Google account from the Ukraine. Google, stop this. You should change your password immediately. change password best to the Gmail team. Now, we are technically savvy folk. We would never fall for this. What's the one red flag in this email? So there's a few. Yeah, bit.ly link, shortening link. We'll talk a little bit about it for those who don't have that experience with using link shorteners. Nowadays, almost all email clients would either expand upon link shortening links or provide previews of link shortening links, or just prevent them altogether depending on your organization's email policy. So in fact, we talk about how people get tricked into clicking these. This would be an example of the too busy executive would be how I would categorize why this person got tricked. What in fact happened, I don't mind using John Podesta, he himself did not originally click this link, but this link was then forwarded just in case, and then some other people associated with the organization, IT experts supposedly, said, hey, this is a legitimate email. Well, once that happens, you're in big trouble, right? Because in fact, it was not a legitimate email and people thought it was and they forwarded it on. And then other people went in and asked them to go through and click that link and change their password and the like. So, and that was not a legitimate password changing link. It was an authentication, credential stealing link that was meant to look like a password changing link. So that can happen. Well, sometimes the whale, the CEO themselves are not that technically savvy. Oftentimes also that person would have staff associated with things like managing basic day-to-day communications, and then you're reliant on those people's expertise and savvy in detecting that these things are happening or not. So kind of the converse, what I mentioned was this idea of CEO fraud, which I think is kind of interesting in how historically it's been quite effective as well. It's the same exact sort of phishing scam, just coming from the exact opposite direction. Instead of spoofing sort of outside resources trying to contact your employees or CEO, it's trying to spoof that the CEO or someone reasonably important is the one actually creating the communication. Where my colleagues got messed up was with the "Hey, are you free right now?" email. I don't know what it means that they think that's how I would communicate via email, but that's the nature of that email, in which by being able to spoof and pretend you're someone important, perhaps someone who's oftentimes traveling and you wouldn't be able to knock on their door or give them a call and reach out to them, often then leads to then follow-up requests asking to buy something or share some information. We learn these techniques, and we always have to at least have the goal of acting ethically in life and using these techniques for preventative and defensive measures. And I co-sign with all that philosophy of a program like ours. At the same time, I look at this and I'm kind of impressed. I don't know that what these scammers are able to accomplish, that they eventually get caught, at least the ones that you read about in the news, and that's why there's articles written about them, because they eventually get caught and wind up serving federal time for it. But this one's kind of impressive. This was someone who just pretended to be a CEO of an actual contractor who does business with Google, and they would basically just send fake invoices. And I guess if you send enough fake invoices to a large enough organization, eventually they get paid. And if you do it enough times and effectively enough, you get to numbers like $100 million. And that's not the only such article. There's quite a few of those examples in which by pretending to be someone who is authorized, it doesn't have to be the CEO, but that's what this term is referred to, someone with sufficient authority, purchasing authority, financial authority in the organization. That turns out that's has been historically a pretty effective line of attack, that by pretending to be that person and interfacing perhaps with subordinates who are more afraid of being seen as non-productive than they are worried about security aspect, you can get people to pay invoices that are completely fake, or just actually transfer funds that they weren't intended to transfer. So that's something you have to watch out for in your organization. And again, it's called CEO fraud, but don't think of it as being one person you have to worry about. Really, anyone with any kind of financial sign-off authority, which could be tens of thousands of people depending on the size of your organization, those are people that there needs to be special protection for spoofing communications, not just going to them, but also communications that are potentially being spoofed as coming from them. You have to protect against both aspects there, whether that's fully fixable via just email solutions, technologically solutions, or if it's really more of a training aspect. I don't think it's necessarily a solved problem today. There's other fun social engineering approaches. So there's Wi-Fi phishing, which you can do all sorts of fun things with. We would never connect to a Wi-Fi access point called free public Wi-Fi, perhaps. But there's fun tools for basically just acting as a man in the middle of Wi-Fi connections. So if you create a rogue access point that has all the same sort of technical characteristics of a legitimate Wi-Fi access point, you can then use that to effectively act as a man in the middle, then further target follow-up phishing attacks or just infect with all sorts of malware. Most cars, this is more my opinion than a stated fact, most cars that have this sort of remote phone entry, I believe, would be very much vulnerable to this kind of attack. The article I have here is about Teslas, and for the most part, I think they're the most interesting target for remotely accessible cars, because their app maybe has a little bit more features in terms of you can tell the car to navigate to where you are via the app and things like that. But the idea being that via just some pretty basic Wi-Fi access point connection, you can then connect remotely and use that as remote key entry to the vehicle. That's becoming more and more common, not less and less common. So while Wi-Fi security is not exactly a solved problem, it's understood that this is an issue. The people who are using cars are much larger than the size of the scope of people who have this sort of technical savvy and can understand aspects like rogue Wi-Fi access points. This is likely to become a bigger and bigger issue than less and less of an issue. But the truth is, if someone wants to steal your car, they don't need to be that technically savvy either. So we talk about locks keeping honest people honest. Maybe it's the same thing here. Protection against rogue access points will really only prevent those who are just playing around, not really wanting to steal your car. There's lots of ways we can obscure those links. So link shorteners are still very much in use today. The idea being that we talk about web applications where one mechanism by which web applications kind of communicate data is via potentially encoding over the URL, right? So that is one way to store session state, to communicate sort of input-output variables of the web application itself. And the resulting URLs that are part of that application are kind of by design not really meant to be human readable anymore. Like the base domain is still probably going to be the web application's base domain, but then the resulting is just going to be some arbitrarily long base 64 string afterwards. And there can be value then in using link shorteners, not just for that scenarios, but just for general scenarios where I just have a very long URL. I'm in some scenario where I have to type it in manually for whatever reason. That's basically why those services exist. Yeah, there's still some value in using those depending on where you're providing your links. That's where you see the tiny URL or bit.ly, and Google used to have their own, and Iowa State has their own as well, a link shortening link that I can just go, and I believe you can as well, go if you have a link you want to be able to share, and perhaps, in fact, the reason I use it for is I have a link that I do need to update pretty frequently, but I don't want to go in and change 100 different web pages. If I just then go and change where this is pointing to, every place I already currently have that pointing to gets automatically updated. And in 2 seconds, I've updated 100 links across 5 different web pages. And so there's some value beyond just making the link itself actually shorter. There's companies that sell that basically link shortening as a tracking service, rightly or wrongly, the idea being you share this particular encoded link and you get your own sort of personal analytics about who is clicking that link, what they're doing at that link there. And there was a time where phishing links could also just be obscured via just relabeling of the link. You can still do that today. That link says www.iastate.edu. That's the text, that's the preview text of that link. That's not actually where that link goes. That's to the new website design, so don't click that while you're in class. Then you have those link shorteners as well. And then things like QR codes are effectively a type of link shortener. Every time you're using a QR code, you are, for the most part, just going to a custom web application URL of the type I talked about here, where there, the idea is that someone is mobile, they're just on their phone, they're not really in a position to click anything. It may be something very physical that you have a poster or something that you want them to go to. So they're just going to just point their camera at a particular QR code, and that will effectively then just provide a link there. QR code could then go to a link shortened or URL, so basically you're sort of doubly obscuring the destination. But for the record, I see some people are not listening to the advice here. Do not follow that link for any reason in class. In fact, I'm gonna skip away from this page so you don't accidentally click any of those links. Nope. There's other ways that I think are a little bit more modern of obscuring these phishing links. Phishing attacks can take advantage of what's known as homoglyphs, which is characters that look sufficiently similar to generate a link that looks reasonably visually similar to a trusted link to sort of convince or con people into clicking those links. This is actually, for a lot of these scenarios, it's quite font dependent. So these examples I'm giving here don't look very convincing, but we'll talk about a few more examples. The idea being that you have a capital O that can look, depending on the font, very similar to a zero. In this font, it doesn't look anything at all the same, so it may seem obvious. Or things like capital I, or lowercase l, or a pipe, or a hyphen versus a minus symbol. That does tend to be, if we're just talking about ASCII characters, that does tend to be pretty font specific, and so for the particular Arial or whatever font these slides are in, it doesn't look too bad. So when I talk about google.com versus google with zeros.com, I think, again, depends on what device you're viewing it on, depends on what your resolution is or how fuzzy the screen is you're reading things on, depends on how much of you're in a rush when you're trying to click something. These days, this type of homoglyph attack is thought of as kind of understood, detectable. Some companies will actually also reserve sort of well-known homoglyph names for their own domain just to prevent that from happening, that link can't even be reserved by anyone else. Sometimes the font makes things that may not appear to be homoglyphs more interesting than otherwise. This is Microsoft.com. What is this one? Can you even see it from back in the class? It's Microsoft.com, but it kind of looks like an M. I mean, kind of, right? With that particular font, there is a little space there. The PayPal versus the PCIpill.com doesn't look, well, first off, there's a typo in it, but beyond that, this is meant to be an A here. Looks kind of sort of similar here. That is with just using traditional sort of ASCII text of the 256 characters that we have access to, the 96 some odd printable characters in our ASCII set. Nowadays, and there was definitely this period of growth where Unicode was being supported more and more as just an attempt, if nothing else, to be more international, to be more inclusive, to be able to support a wider set of methods of expressing text information, just foreign languages, if nothing else. We were in this period of time where more and more applications, certainly web applications and supporting software, were supporting Unicode, but not really understanding necessarily the underlying sort of homoglyph implications of it. Because while you may say, yes, capital O and zero are in fact different characters, and I can see that, or lowercase l versus pipe are in fact different characters, and they are in the ASCII character set, Unicode is quite massive. And I debated how much I wanted us to cover Unicode in this class. If you're going to become a security professional, I think you need to be aware of Unicode eventually. So if not in this class in much depth, that's a topic you need to kind of explore enough to gain an appreciation for what it's all about. One way we can think about Unicode, if we don't want to dive into sort of the technical implementation of it, is if our ASCII set is this 8-bit set, so 256 possible characters, for the most part, the characters we've come to know and love and associated with keys on a keyboard and the like. Unicode is everything else we would ever want to encode. Kind of by design, to be as inclusive and as expressive as possible. Every emoji you've ever used is directly encoded as a Unicode character. Every possible foreign character set, to the extent is possible, is potentially located in our Unicode set here. If ASCII is 8 bits, meaning up to 256, our Unicode can go up to 32 bits, so up to 4 billion different characters there. And it's hard for us to think of like 4 billion different characters, and it's not fully used as of yet, But effectively, anything you can think of is probably already somewhere in the Unicode set here. And for that reason, the potential for homoglyphs is way worse with Unicode than it is for just pure ASCII. So we had this period of transition that was kind of interesting where applications, and they're still, to some extent, still in this period of transition, applications are attempting to support Unicode more and more. It's not quite a binary thing. And as you look into the implementation of it and the encoding and decoding of it, it's potentially a little bit more work and then followed by a lot more work to fully support it. But as applications were looking to support it more and more as kind of a feature to be added to an existing web application, for instance, this potential for sort of phishing and related malfeasance with the homoglyphs associated with Unicode became a bigger and bigger problem. Still not exactly a solved problem today. For the specific issue of URLs using these homoglyphs, it's effectively a solved problem, but it still requires a little bit of user awareness that this is happening. So I'll show it in more detail on the next slide. But Unicode plus 430, so just take it for this part of the Cyrillic alphabet, this character looks like Latin A, Latin lowercase a. And the resulting domains, again, Microsoft versus RN Microsoft, we kind of can see. Even though it's not that different, it's just really just a couple pixels of space, right? But we can see it. Depending on the font, depending on the size of our screen, depending on how quickly we're looking at links, we can see it. This one, I would argue, you cannot see. That is implemented in the same font family with two completely different encodings and two completely different domains. So hopefully you can see why that becomes a problem here. And this slide shows an overlay of the two fonts, the two characters in the same exact font. And they are technically different, but it's pretty subtle, right? These are vector fonts, so it's not really a measure of pixels of difference, but in terms of percentages of difference, you can argue that the Cyrillic small letter a has a little bit of a sharper curve in a couple places, very subtly than the actual Latin small letter a. But I would argue they're effectively the same. In terms of visually, this A versus the Cyrillic A, they are effectively the same. And that is just one such example. Unicode is massive. Again, we're talking a 24 to 32-bit space of possible encodings of things versus just the 96 or so Latin characters and keyboard characters we have as part of our ASCII character set. For basically everything in the ASCII character set, there's an equivalent problem of a Unicode encoding or multiple Unicode encodings that look visually very similar, if not effectively exactly the same. And in terms of expressing information, that's not really a problem. If for some reason somebody actually inserts a Cyrillic A versus a Latin A, and you're just trying to say the word iastate.edu, it's not really a problem. It still looks visually correct. The issue is when we're encoding information, specifically for phishing, when we're encoding URLs for domains for people to click on. That's why that's a phishing risk here. Just like Google with zeros versus Google with O's, it's kind of a ham-fisted attempt at a phishing link. Now iastate with Unicode versus iastate with just pure ASCII becomes a real phishing risk. Today, all major web browsers support a kind of standardized solution, quote-unquote solution for this. It's referred to as Punycode. Let's talk about Punycode. We'll pick this up right here on Tuesday. I want to make sure you understand the basic algorithm associated with it. The link iastate.edu with the Cyrillic A becomes something that no longer looks like iastate.edu anymore. It is still a phishing risk because that requires you to explore in the URL bar itself that this is not the link I thought I was clicking. So it still requires some kind of technical savvy, some extra little bit of attention that you otherwise wouldn't have to pay for the links that you're clicking. Let's leave things here for today. We'll pick up right here on Tuesday.